Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for your presence. So I'm delighted to moderate this conference on multilateralism and glad to introduce our two participants. First, Jacques Maire. Good afternoon. So you are a member of parliament in France and member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. You have been elected member of parliament in 2017 after diverse diplomatic experience, for example, as the diplomatic advisor of the Prime Minister Bérégovoy. And Darren Bergman, who has some connection issues, so I hope he'll be able to join very soon. He's member of parliament in South Africa and Shadow Minister of International Relations and Cooperations. And to say just a few words about myself, I will graduate this year from a master's in public affairs at Sciences Po, and after several experiences also in French diplomacy. So this will be a 55 minutes conference, maybe short-turned with the delay, unfortunately. The first 30 first minutes will be dedicated to a discussion between the two of you, and the time that remains will be dedicated to a Q&A session with the audience. So first, to introduce the subject of multilateralism, marking the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres noted that there is today a surplus of multilateral challenges and a deficit of multilateral solutions. And indeed, the current challenges we are facing are more and more global, such as climate change, of course, but also online hate speech. And it is also essential to recognize the significant contribution multilateralism made to world economic growth, development, and employment. However, various geopolitical and socioeconomic tensions put a strain on the international order, for example, at the UN, but also in other traditional international institutions. So my first question may be to start with Jacques Maire and waiting for Darren Bergman, would be, do you think the current threat to multilateralism is structural or short-term, and why?
Thank you, Mathilde, and hello to everybody. Darren is among us. I see him and I say hello.
Okay. Hi.
Hello. Bonjour.
Bonjour. Very pleased to be with you today. Yes, it's true. It's I would say Mr. Gutierrez is very close to the French view of international relations, and we had some occasions to discuss with him on this topic. And it's true that seeing from his position, from his seat, really things are getting more and more difficult. When you see the dynamism, I would say in the past 40 or 50 years, there was a kind of domination of some like-minded countries at the level of the UNs. I mean, with Western countries with a high capacity of finance, of support, and high also military capacity, had a kind of I would say domination, ideological domination on the situation. More and more, what we see is a challenge coming from emerging countries, certainly sometimes for a more balanced governance, but also for more confrontation also. You can feel it with the fact that basically there are two main powers now who challenge, I would say, the multilateral system based on regulation, of course, financial institutions, and international organization, and the three of them are challenged by the situation. The first challenger, of course, is the US, I mean, which is paradoxical because it is the one who founded these organizations, and I would say probably designed them in order to better serve its interests and values. And of course, we can say that with the election of Joe Biden, it might be completely the opposite. I don't think so. I think that the importance of domestic topics and the impact of these topics in the, I would say, global regulation is something which will go on. And it's true that for Americans also, I mean, I would say that the world is a bit black and white. Multilateralism is about acknowledging the differences, cultural and on, and I think that for US today, there are those allies who share the values, and there are those who are against. And the first opponent is China. And I think that when you see the dynamics, of course, opposition between China and the US is really, I would say, the key driver of the situation now. Can give you a kind of assessment of China behavior also. China is a kind of double language. First, playing the part of globalization and multilateralism that has even been said a few days ago by Xi Jinping in Davos. And what you see here is a lot of financing, a lot of presence, a lot of contributions also, and more and more influence in the organization, and also targeting, for example, specific institutions who are there to define standards and patterns. Like there are 5 international organizations which are led by the Chinese now, and all of them are a very specific economic impact. Like the Agency for Development, Industrial Development, the one for civil aviation, the one for telecommunication, the one for health, that's very important now, and the one for food and agricultural. So when you take over these elements, you play the influence. The second point, which is much more, I would say, detrimental to the global situation, is they play really a kind of power game. Just a way to look at it is to consider what is the behavior of states in the ECOSOC, for example, or Assembly General, when you talk about Taiwan or Tibet or Uyghur or Hong Kong. You see year after year, those who vote in favor of texts which are aggressive towards China decreasing dramatically. It was the vast majority 20 years ago, and now it's less and less. And apart from Europeans, there are not many more. And why so? Because the pressure is direct. It's a political pressure. It's I would say it's a financial pressure. It's a direct pressure. So as a consequence, it's structural, and for me a good basis of that, you can see it. It's the Security Council of the UN, which is completely blocked. There are, just to put it simply, on one side, US followed by UK, I mean the good, and the evil, which is China, and in between, Russia trying to be, okay, I am dependent from China, there is no other choice, but I want to have some room for my own interests. And that is very strong to feel it. And when you discuss with permanent members of the Security Council, you see that, as an example, it's a good example, probably 70% of the topics are put forward on the agenda by France today, and mainly African topics, which shows what? Which shows there is no appetite to play, I would say, a role for this Security Council by many members. I'm talking about the permanent members, of course, not the others. So for me, it's structural and it's long-term. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Bergman, you would like to respond?
Yeah, look, I definitely agree with my colleague as well, you know, that we're looking at it as structural. I think the generalization of the West and the East is also going to be problematic, in that we see enemies arising both in the West and the East, neighbors to each other. So what you would traditionally call the West and what you would traditionally call the East are actually becoming enemies in each other. And you see, like the example of in my own continent, where you've got Africa and you've got the African Union. The African Union itself now we've just been chairing the African Union from a South African point of view, and you're sitting with COVID-19, you're sitting with the election results that have really gone badly, with violence, with dictatorships that should never have taken place, presidents that have taken the veil of COVID-19 and advanced their own power. Even myself, unfortunately, my delay in connecting has actually been as a result of load shedding, and we might find ourselves disconnecting because of load shedding. The African Union finds itself now cut between what does it do for all the countries under its membership? Who does it side with? Does it side with the people? Does it side with its loyalty to the presidents? And which countries? You've got countries paying membership to this organization, and then you've got the UN, and the UN's obviously got the AU who pays membership to the UN, and the UN's got a barrage of memberships that are paying membership to the UN, that are victims of I don't want to say of the African Union, they're victims of their own leaders, but they've paid membership, and they'd want this multilateralism to follow suit. They'd want these bodies to have shown power, or to at least come to, this is the time where multilateralism is most important, would have been through times of COVID, through times of power steal. And this is where, unfortunately, we're finding that multilateralism is failing us. And, the structure is exactly what befalls us at this point in time. So this is where we are.
So we've noted that this multilateralism today is threatened. And what kind of solutions would you give to that? How, according to you, should we transform today's institutions to make them more efficient? And what kind of multilateralism should we foster? Maybe Mr. Bergman first and Mr. Maire then.
Well, I definitely think wrongfully we've looked at politicians to fix our problems, when in the past I think it's actually been business people or activists that should be the ones at the forefront of solutions. We find that the best people with empathy are possibly the activists, or possibly business people that have the experience of negotiations or solutions. Politicians should probably stay in the lawmaking and possibly stay in the legislation of the country that they know. In the UN, I don't find a country or a person yet that doesn't agree that the UN needs structural reform. Every single person you speak to date believes that the UN requires structural reform. Everyone is calling for structural reform within the UN. They all believe that the UN has failed us to date in many aspects. So, I mean, it's always been a big, audacious project. So it's not that we're saying the UN has done bad or been bad for the greatest, for the greater good. But we do believe that the UN requires change and reform. And I would suggest that at this stage, there's a great exercise called Democracy Without Borders. There's a position paper that suggests that a more integrated solution would require all countries represented with a broad spectrum of people, not just politicians. It's business people, it's, as I say, activists sitting on a parliament that represents all countries and are able to represent in a parliament that sits all the time and discusses all aspects of the UN. Very different to the RPU that exists in the UN currently.
Mr. Maire?
Yes, I think it's difficult to have one single point of view on that, because first you may say that it would be possible to look for more flexible solutions. Then there is one which is flexible, which is the G7, G8, G20, where there is no commitment, just convergence on certain topics, which is at the origin, it's a good idea. How to have, I would say, instead of silo approaches by very vertical organizations, which are international bureaucracies like the UN, WTO, ILO, and so on. You have common views of the leaders based on a clear agenda and a common agenda, and then you go to the level. It's the level of, I would say, a level of engagement. Sorry, just in a second, because there is some noise just beside, and I have to stop it before going on. Just a
What he was just saying may be of interest for you, for the audience, as you are preparing Youth 7 and Youth 20. It's very interesting also how informal groups can make a difference. Yes.
Sorry, wait. And I say that you can say, okay, it's good to have this kind of pragmatic approaches between leaders, but at the end of the day, what they produce is not law or regulation. It's more or less a bit more of coordination between actors, which is not bad. But it doesn't replace, I would say, rights given to people, I would say mediation capacities, and there is no empowerment behind that. So that's a point. What you can say also is that, okay, there can even is a competition between the two aspects. As an example, when you look at what was the real place where the discussions against the pandemic situation took place, it took place first in WHO, but it was clearly marginalized. It was more a platform of exchange of information. Then it took place 1 month after at the Security Council of the UN, which was very, very late. And in reality, the important topics were discussed during the G20 and G8, in fact. Even if at the end of the day, with COVAX and other initiatives, WHO played a role in that, but limited one. So I would say pragmatism is not about everything, but sometimes it was more. It revealed to be more efficient. Last point is a bit probably about regionalization or alternative to the current international organization. What I feel is that the value of global multilateralism are defended very much in Europe. And the kind of multilateralism which is proposed by Europe is probably those Europeans share together, which is based on rule of law, democracy, and I would say our core values. When you look at the way, for example, Chinese, and I'm not a primary anti-Chinese guy, don't misunderstand me, promote all their, I would say, their cooperation, like a Shanghai conference, like the infrastructure bank. It's not about equal footing for people. It's about an agenda of domination. So regionalization doesn't mean, in fact, always multilateralism. It means often a way to exert power over dominant people. So, and last point, I agree with Darren. I would say when you look at the impact and the capacity of private actors, they are sometimes much more efficient. If you speak, for example, about freedom of speech, you see that the impact which is related to the decision of Mr. Zuckerberg and Twitter is much more important than any kind of regulation right now. But how can we manage a full, I would say, in the multilateralism? So it means that if we do not engage with these actors, there is something to be missed.
Thank you very much. And maybe in the questions, we'll come back to the legitimacy of those actors who are not elected, but who really more and more engage in that way. And maybe another question would be that we are seeing that multilateralism has become a political opinion, like Trump versus Biden or Le Pen versus Macron. How do we recreate consensus around a multilateral project, as all the solutions to our current problems are global? And how to make multilateralism a lever for the people and for democracy, in order not to have an ultra-liberal order that doesn't seem to serve the people. So to find a balance between serving the people and having a multilateral engagement. Maybe Mr. Maire first. You are in mute.
It's not an easy question because you've got powers who play the institutions in order to block them and to destroy them. As an example, when you feel, okay, let's talk about Russia. So I am the rapporteur of the poisoning and detention of Navalny currently for the Council of Europe. It's a hard job. And it's true that when we deal with this topic, there are two, I would say, investigations right now. The first one is in the UN by my friend and colleague, who is Mrs. Calamar, Agnès Calamar, who was very known for the Khashoggi case. And Mrs. Calamar said, okay, I will make my report, but it will go to the Human Rights Committee of the UN, and there will be no outcome because Russia and its allies, who are autocratic regimes, they play exactly the role in order to block any initiative or any consequence. When we deal with that in the context of the Council of Europe, it's purely parliamentarian. It's not I would say, intergovernmental. And then there is a rule of majority. And we can go to direct, I would say, clear and I would say directions where we can assess the situation in Navalny compared on a state of law and also conventions which have been signed and implemented within Russia. And this will be much more harmful and much more efficient, even if the scope of the organization is more limited because it's only Europe, but bigger Europe, and it will have more consequences, in fact. So what I feel is that intergovernmentalism has very strong limits when government competes against each other. So the way is how to push on other form of representation, which give more say to people, and of course you can rely on NGOs and activists. But I think and I pray for my own parish, but I think that the role of parliamentarians, but that differently from Darren just said, that we represent people. We are not completely in the hands of the governments. We protect people from the states. That's what we do in our country, at least in democratic country, and that's what we can do in, I would say, at global level. So that's a possibility. And as an example related to Africa, we were very active to push an interparliamentarian body, which is called the Comité Interparlementaire G5 Sahel. So the G5 Sahel parliamentarians are there to have a say to the structural, I would say, cooperation in development and defense between Europe and I would say those who finance the developments and the populations. And we know that the issue is corruption in these governments. But if you give the power and the right to say to those parliamentarians who represent all the regions of the Sahel, of the ethnies of the Sahel, then you have a very different dialogue. Probably last point, there is an example which I like very much, which is ILO, International Labour Organization, which was created in 1919. It is the oldest one, still alive. And it's a tripartite organization with unions, worker unions, with business leaders, and with governments. And that's a very different kind of approach, which gives more capacity, because if unions coalesce with employers, then they beat the governments, and so on and so forth. So there is a dynamic, and there is a way to be more imaginative.
Thank you very much for these proposals. Darren, would you like to respond, to add?
Yeah, look, I mean, from my side, I think that it's important to note that I'm a free marketeer, so I believe that in the free markets, but it would be nice with all the free trade agreements that are taking place around the world on the continents. There's it's important that they do take place. Unfortunately, I think it's the untold stories or the amount of human rights abuses that take place. You know, for every country that makes, there has to be a country that loses in a free trade agreement, and that's where an abuse would take place. In the sense that you know, in Africa, let's say that there's a lot of female-headed households or child-headed households, and their basic income is to cross the border and sell their food from their farms, and that tends to some issues. And of course, so when you talk about free trade agreements and you talk about nationalization on a continental basis, it's great to have something where your multilateralism, well, the lack of multilateralism, stimulates probably more nationalization, and you're getting an economy stimulated on the continental basis. But you also need a watchdog. You know, you're hoping to, with nationalization comes possibly more prone to war, continental war, and less diplomacy. And multilateralism brings about diplomacy. So you'd want a body that brings about diplomacy and is a watchdog and effective, has teeth when it comes to diplomacy. So, you know, on the one hand, it's a catch-22 situation. What are you looking at multilateralism for? Is it for trade, or is it diplomacy, or can you have both? You know, is it, and you know, I've often thought, what's more important, trade or sports events? Because on either side, if you've got trade, you won't have war, and if you've got sports events, you won't have war. And where you've got trade and sports events, you've got diplomacy, and you might not need multilateralism. Might not need these worldly bodies because then they govern themselves. But the truth is, at this stage, where you've got the haves and you've got the have-nots, and there's definitely a disconnect, and we're even in this day and age having to debate the success or the failure of multilateralism. Then there's definitely shows a need for diplomacy, which shows the need for the fact that multilateralism is still important to us. And unfortunately, whilst that is still the case, nationalization, although appealing to many states and continents, unfortunately shows us that there's still a need for multilateralism. And whilst there is that case, we just got to take what we have and make it better and improve on it. So something like COVID, which showed us how the world was so underprepared, and showed us, you know, we had an organization in South Africa where people were locked away, they were locked outside of South Africa just in seconds. And I'm sure that, you know, I'm sure the world could tell the same stories where they had their own citizens stuck all over the world and were running out of money, running out of medicines. And this was unprecedented. They couldn't get to their own visas, they couldn't get their own passports extended, and they couldn't get back into their own countries. And all of a sudden, the world doesn't know what to do. You know, we got the most technology ever, we got the most advanced medicines ever, and yet we back in 1900s. And you know, it just shows how vulnerable we are, and while the need for multilateralism, but not for talk, more for action, and more for working together in stimulated exercises and practices, and not talk, you know, rather in actual, well, this is vaccines, how do we get them to every single person and not the richest countries? This is the plans for if COVID-21 or COVID-22 come out. This is how we would be prepared the next time it happens. Not necessarily it would be China next time, it could be anywhere else next time. You know, these are the kind of things that one would have to prepare for and start talking now.
Thank you very much to both of you for these proposals for solutions. Maybe we can start the Q&A sessions for the 10 minutes left. So to all the audience, you can either ask your questions in the chat or by opening your microphone. And I already see one question in the chat, which echoes what you said, Mr. Maire. which is how important is the parliamentary diplomacy in today's international relations. I see it's developing, but does it have a real influence on the global agenda?
Okay, that's a very good point, because it is something which is clearly very poorly known by people, and particularly in France, because there is a double French tradition which goes a bit against that. The first one is the importance of the government and the executive. There is a kind of reserved sector, which is defense and diplomacy, which belongs more to the executive, which is not the case, for example, in certain countries where we've got the army under control, direct control of the parliament. And so that creates a shadow. And the second point is that in many countries, diplomacy is mostly related to multilateralism, notably because of a middle-sized country, which thinks that, okay, we don't have as much a kind of specific diplomacy. We don't have our say to anything. And French are not like that. They think that they have something to say about everything. And if UN or I don't know, WHO doesn't say the good, then we have to take position. And so they expect France to take the lead or to take position in many things. So as a consequence, I would say the parliaments are a bit behind. That's true. Nevertheless, can give you some examples. First example, the visit of Mr. Sisi in France a few weeks ago from the leader of Egypt. There was an important mobilization of many MPs in order to much more control, I would say, the technologies of interception and interpretation of communications in this country, related to a report that I produced in November about the fact that these technologies of control and algorithm are much more detrimental to the human rights than classical weapons, because they just put pressure. So this topic, which was not on the agenda between France and Egypt on the executive side, was on the agenda on the legislative side and had some consequences. And so that's an example. Second example, of course, which I mentioned just before, multilateralism. In the UN, it's intergovernmental. The special representative for disappeared people, Agnès Calamar, is very much constrained by the necessity of consensus within the Committee of Human Rights. In the Council of Europe, I would say the armed arm, the arm is the European Court of Human Rights, which is a very strong one, but the political engine is the Assembly. So it is the Assembly, and these are the parliaments. We decide at what occasion we trigger an action, and we ask the Human Open Court via the Committee of Ministers to do something specific. So these are some examples. And last point is about the way to promote contacts. Again, one example, that there was the level of confrontation between France and Turkey was very high in the last quarter in 2020. So it's a sudden change of behavior of Mr. Erdogan since a few weeks for certain reasons, which are related probably to internal difficulties, related to the fact that Europe is a big stake in terms of Turkish economy, and so on and so forth. And we had very important signals coming from Turkey since a few months saying, okay, it is going worse, but there is no consensus in Turkey. And I would say, besides the intergovernmental dispute, which was very strong, there were many, many contacts which showed that there was an appetite to come back to normal discussions at the level of I would say, the internal politics there.
Thank you very much. And one other question that could be asked to you, Mr. Bergman, would be if we allow activists and public people to be part of the political decision, we need to talk about the legitimacy of private actors, so NGOs, private companies, etc. Yes. Maybe you can say a few words about that. What about the legitimacy of those activists?
Well, look, definitely. I mean, a vetting procedure would take place, and I think when I say that, I'm talking more importantly around the negotiations of peace treaties and that, and when it comes to negotiating of settlements. Often, if you look at the UN resolutions, if you take what's come to the Human Rights Commission, you can take that if you studied the last, let's say, 100 resolutions, one country comes to the UN 70% of the time, yet there's possibly atrocities around the world, and that country is possibly responsible only 30% of the time for what's taking place. And yet those don't see the light of day of the other 70%. And what we're missing out on is resolutions that could have actually protected children and women in other countries. And you see the same thing taking place with maybe in the Human Rights Commission, where you've got certain countries being headed up or chaired, where women don't have any rights. They don't have a right to hold a driver's license or vote. And yet this country is now chairing the Human Rights Commission. And now again, this is politics, but where's the activism in this regard? Now, if you take, and please understand this, let me clarify this, because I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. But if you take the last few peace treaties that were signed, and I don't believe they were Donald Trump that necessarily negotiated the peace treaty, but what was negotiated was businessmen that settled those peace treaties with regards to Israel, America, and the UAEs. Now, those are historic in many ways. And, if you told me 5 years ago that this was going to take place, I don't think I was going to tell you that Trump would have been responsible for doing so, or that his aides were going to be doing so. But these were business people that were doing so. Now, I study conflict around the world. That is why I'm actually a big fan of France, because France does have parliamentarians, and France does have, France has been at the forefront of diplomacy. But what you're looking at what you're looking at when you look at America, and what you look at when you look at Trump, when you look at conflict, this is not the kind of person that's going to resolve conflict. When you look at conflict within the Middle East, or you look at conflict between Russia and Ukraine, or you look at the conflict with Morocco and West Sahara, these aren't the people that are going to solve that conflict. I've always said it's only going to be diplomacy in terms of sports or business people or the on the ground activism that solves it, because the politicians are too involved. The politicians are in it for it's almost a calculated response. And this is where I believe that if you want results, don't send in the politicians. If you want results, send in the business people, or send in the activists. And that's where I'm getting at, as a politician myself, just by the way. So don't get me wrong there.
Yes, thank you very much. We have we have 1 last minute. So maybe if you can respond very, very quickly, could the presidency of the FAO, ICAO, OECD by China be considered as a means to regionalize Asian interests under Chinese rule? To what extent does Chinese influence reshape the Occidental view on international relations and diplomacy? Are we facing a shift in power politics where regionalism predominates over multilateralism? Great question, but we have only 1 minute.
No, 30 seconds for that. Just to say that these organizations are very important. They are standard setters. So if you manage, and if you, I would say, manage the standards, then you can position yourself. And that you can also, I would say, expand your own vision of the topics. As an example, WHO, of course, it's a topic about, it was managed as the control on WHO was a kind of a tool in order to limit the transparency of China against pandemics, of course. And about food and health organization, you can say that, for example, the role of for example, the land status, the statute of land, it's a very important topic for the Chinese, and the fact that they want to expand their capacity to control, I would say, foreign territories in order to have a kind of free and cheap market for food is an element which is important in the way they see the role of the food and health, food and agricultural organization.
Thank you very much to both of you, Darren Bergman and Jacques Maire, for your participation. Thank you also very much for all the audience for being there. I hope this was useful for you as you are preparing the forum for being delegate. Yes, I hope to see you again. And thanks again for this fruitful conversation.